Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and reaching for your phone, and nothing happens. The screen stays black. You walk to the kitchen, flip the light switch, and nothing. You open your front door and step outside, and the neighborhood is silent in a way you have never heard silence before. No hum of air conditioners, no distant traffic signals, no garage doors opening, no car engines turning over, just silence and the smell of ozone in the air, and a sky that, if you had been awake the night before, might have looked like the most beautiful thing you had ever seen in your entire life. What happened to you, what happened to everyone, was not a cyber attack. It was not a war. It was not the collapse of a government or the failure of a financial system. What happened was the sun. The very star that has been keeping life alive on this planet for 4.5 billion years decided, in the span of a single morning, to remind us exactly how fragile the civilization we built around its light truly is. This is the story of a solar superstorm, and I want you to understand something before we go any further. This is not science fiction. This is not a thought experiment invented to sell disaster preparedness kits. This is physics. This is history. And based on everything we know about how the sun works and how our grid was built, this is a scenario that scientists have been warning about for decades. Not as a possibility, but as an inevitability. The only real question has never been whether it will happen. The only question has always been when. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning, in this case, is not on Earth. The beginning is 93 million miles away, at the surface of a star. The sun, for all its magnificence, is not a calm and peaceful place. It is a roiling, churning, violently unstable ball of plasma with a magnetic field so complex and so dynamic that even today, with all of our instruments and satellites and supercomputers, we cannot fully predict what it will do next. The surface of the sun reaches temperatures of roughly 5,500 degrees Celsius. But the corona, the outer atmosphere that extends millions of miles into space, somehow reaches temperatures of 1 to 3 million degrees. Scientists call this the coronal heating problem. We still do not fully understand it. And this is the sun, the object closest to Earth, the most studied astronomical body in the history of human civilization. What we do understand is this. The sun operates on an 11-year cycle of magnetic activity. During what we call solar maximum, the peak of each cycle, the sun's magnetic field becomes deeply tangled and unstable. Sunspots appear across its surface in great numbers. Dark regions where magnetic field lines have become so concentrated and twisted that they suppress the usual convection of hot plasma, making those areas slightly cooler than their surroundings. These sunspots are not small. An individual sunspot can be larger than the entire planet Earth. And they are the breeding grounds for the most violent energy releases in the solar system. When those twisted magnetic field lines snap, when they reconnect in a sudden catastrophic realignment, the energy released is almost incomprehensible. We call these events solar flares. In a matter of minutes, a solar flare can release as much energy as 1 billion hydrogen bombs detonating simultaneously. The energy blasts outward across the electromagnetic spectrum. Gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet radiation, all traveling at the speed of light, reaching Earth in just 8 minutes. But a solar flare is only the opening act. What often follows is something far more dangerous: a coronal mass ejection, or CME. This is when the sun doesn't just release radiation. It physically expels billions of tons of magnetized plasma into space. A massive coronal mass ejection can contain 10 billion tons of solar material traveling at speeds of up to 3,000 kilometers per second. These are clouds of charged particles, and they carry with them a magnetic field. And when that magnetic field collides with Earth's own magnetic field, the one that has been protecting life on this planet for billions of years, it triggers what we call a geomagnetic storm. Most geomagnetic storms are mild. They create beautiful auroras visible at higher latitudes, the northern lights, the southern lights, and they cause minor disruptions to radio communications and GPS signals. Most people never notice them at all. But occasionally, rarely but inevitably, the sun produces a coronal mass ejection of extraordinary size, aligned perfectly with Earth's position, carrying a magnetic field oriented in exactly the wrong direction to interact maximally with our planet's magnetosphere. When that happens, the result is not a mild disruption. The result is a geomagnetic catastrophe that can reshape civilization overnight. We know this because it has happened before. And when it happened, we got extraordinarily lucky, because when it happened, we didn't have a grid to destroy. September 1st, 1859. A British astronomer named Richard Carrington was sitting at his telescope, doing what astronomers do, observing the sun, cataloging sunspots, going about his methodical scientific work. And then he saw something he had never seen before. A flash of intense white light erupted from a cluster of sunspots. He checked his equipment. He called for a colleague. By the time his colleague arrived, the flash had already faded. But Carrington wrote down exactly what he had seen, and he recorded the precise time. 17 hours later, far faster than any solar disturbance had ever been observed to travel, Earth was hit by the largest geomagnetic storm in recorded history. The magnetic disturbance was so severe that telegraph systems around the world, the internet of the 19th century, failed catastrophically. Telegraph operators reported receiving electric shocks from their equipment. Some telegraph stations caught fire. Telegraph lines that had been disconnected from their batteries continued to operate anyway, driven entirely by the geomagnetically induced currents flowing through the wires. The auroras were visible as far south as Cuba, Hawaii, and even Colombia. People in the northeastern United States thought the sun had risen early. Miners in the Rocky Mountains woke up and started making breakfast because they were certain morning had come. The storm that hit Earth that September was later estimated to have a magnitude of roughly negative 1,700 nanoteslas, the measure we use to quantify disturbances to Earth's magnetic field. By comparison, a severe modern geomagnetic storm might reach negative 300 nanoteslas. The Carrington event was roughly 5 to 6 times more powerful than the worst storms we have seen in the modern era. And scientists who have studied the sediment record and ice cores from around that period believe that the Carrington event, while extreme, was not actually unprecedented in the deep history of our planet. There may have been events even larger, far larger. Now here is what should make every electrical engineer on the planet lose sleep. In 1859, humanity's electrical infrastructure consisted primarily of telegraph wires. Copper wires strung on wooden poles across a continent. The damage caused by the Carrington event to that primitive system was extraordinary, but it was recoverable. Telegraph operators reconnected their batteries, replaced burned components, and within a day or two the system was mostly running again. The total economic damage, while significant, was manageable. Today's electrical grid is not a series of telegraph wires strung on wooden poles. Today's electrical grid is the most complex machine ever built by human beings. It is an interconnected web of generating stations, transmission lines, transformers, substations, and distribution networks that spans entire continents. The North American grid alone serves roughly 330 million people across the United States and Canada and parts of Mexico. It runs on alternating current synchronized to a precise frequency, 60 cycles per second in North America, 50 cycles per second in most of the rest of the world. And maintaining that synchronization across thousands of miles of transmission infrastructure is an engineering achievement so remarkable that we have long since stopped appreciating how remarkable it truly is. The critical vulnerability, the point of failure that keeps engineers and national security experts and FEMA planners up at night, is the transformer. Specifically, the large high-voltage transformers that form the backbone of the transmission system. These are the enormous pieces of equipment, each the size of a house, each weighing hundreds of tons, each custom-built to specific parameters, that step voltages up from generation levels to transmission levels, sometimes as high as 765 kilovolts, and then back down again for distribution to homes and businesses. Without these transformers, there is no grid. There is no electricity. There is nothing. When a massive geomagnetic storm hits Earth, the rapidly changing magnetic field induces electric currents in the ground itself. These are called geomagnetically induced currents, or GICs. Long conductors, pipeline networks, railway tracks, undersea cables, and most critically, high-voltage transmission lines act as antennas for these currents. The GICs that flow into the grid don't follow the nice, clean 60 cycle per second alternating pattern that the grid is designed to handle. They are quasi-direct currents, slow, steady, in some cases almost unchanging. and large power transformers are fundamentally incompatible with direct current flowing through them. The direct current causes the transformer core to saturate, to become magnetically overwhelmed, which in turn causes the transformer to draw enormous reactive power from the grid, generate extreme heat, and produce harmonic disturbances that propagate throughout the connected network. In a severe enough storm, this process can destroy a large power transformer in a matter of minutes. The insulation burns, the windings melt, the oil inside the transformer overheats and can ignite, and unlike a blown fuse or a tripped circuit breaker, components that can be reset or replaced in hours, a large high-voltage transformer is not something you fix quickly. In the United States, there are roughly 2,000 of these critical high-voltage transformers in service. They are not manufactured domestically in anything like sufficient quantities. The United States imports most of them from a small number of foreign manufacturers, primarily in South Korea, Germany, and a handful of other countries. The typical lead time, from ordering a replacement transformer to having it delivered, transported, installed, and tested, is 12 to 18 months under normal conditions. If a Carrington-scale event were to destroy even a fraction of those transformers simultaneously, if the storm took out, say, 300 or 400 of the most critical high-voltage transformers on the North American grid, the lead time for replacement would not be 12 to 18 months. It would be years, possibly decades, because every other country in the world would be simultaneously trying to replace their own destroyed transformers, competing for the same limited global manufacturing capacity that had itself been damaged by the same storm. Let that sink in for a moment. Not hours, not days. Years without electricity across large portions of the most technologically advanced nation on Earth. The National Academy of Sciences released a study in 2008, a study that did not get nearly the attention it deserved, estimating that a Carrington-scale geomagnetic storm could cause up to $2 trillion in economic damage in the first year alone, with a full recovery taking 4 to 10 years. A 2013 study by Lloyd's of London, not a government agency with a political agenda, but an insurance market that gets paid to assess risk accurately, estimated that a major geomagnetic storm could affect between 20 and 40 million people in the United States, with power outages lasting anywhere from 16 days to 2 years, depending on the severity and the specific geography of transformer failures. And a study published in the journal Space Weather in 2019 concluded that the probability of a Carrington-scale event occurring in any given decade is somewhere between 6 and 12%. 6 to 12% per decade. If you have lived for 40 years as an adult in the modern era, the cumulative probability that a civilization-threatening solar superstorm has hit Earth during your lifetime is approaching 50%. It hasn't happened yet, but the odds don't reset. They accumulate, and the sun does not care about our schedules. So let's talk about what actually happens. Not in the abstract, not in the language of policy papers and risk assessments. Let's walk through it, hour by hour, day by day, the way you would actually experience it if you were living in a major American city when the grid fails. It starts the night before. If the storm is large enough and arrives at the right angle, the first sign is the auroras. People in Atlanta and Dallas and Los Angeles who have never seen the northern lights in their lives step outside to see the sky alive with color. Green curtains of light, red and purple streamers, rippling and shifting across the entire visible sky from horizon to horizon. People photograph it on their phones. It trends on every social media platform. Amateur astronomers post breathless updates. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center has already issued severe geomagnetic storm watches. But those warnings, buried in technical government websites, communicated to grid operators but not to the general public in any urgent or comprehensible way, have not reached most people. Most people are just standing in their backyards, looking up, thinking it is the most beautiful thing they have ever seen. At roughly 3 in the morning, the first transformer failures begin. They happen quietly and quickly. Substations in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas are the first to go. The geomagnetically induced currents flowing into the grid from the highly conductive geology of the Canadian Shield are extraordinarily intense at these latitudes. Automatic protection systems detect abnormal conditions and attempt to isolate affected equipment. Some transformers trip offline before they are destroyed. Others are not so lucky. Within 90 minutes, a cascade of protection system responses has rippled through the interconnected grid in a way that the designers of those protection systems never intended, each protective action creating new instabilities that trigger further protective actions, the failures propagating like dominoes across hundreds of miles of transmission infrastructure. By 4:30 in the morning, the lights are out across most of the Northeast. New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., dark. Chicago, dark. The Pacific Northwest, dark. In those first hours, most people don't even know yet. They are asleep. Their phone batteries still have charge. They wake up, reach for the light switch, find it doesn't work, and assume a local outage. They check their phones, still working because cell towers have battery backup. They see the news. They see the scope of it. And most of them, honestly, still don't fully grasp what has happened, because in modern American life, power outages happen. Hurricanes cause power outages. Thunderstorms cause power outages. Ice storms. It always comes back. It always comes back. The utility trucks come, the linemen work through the night, and it comes back. This time, it does not come back. By day 2, the situation has clarified itself with brutal efficiency. Approximately 40% of the United States is without power. The areas with the most critical transformer losses, the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, parts of the Pacific Northwest, are now facing the realization that this is not a standard restoration scenario. Cell towers, which typically have between 4 and 8 hours of battery backup, have gone dark in most affected areas. ATMs are offline. Credit card processing is down. Gas stations cannot pump gas. Even stations with underground tanks full of fuel cannot operate their pumps without electricity. Grocery stores are locked. Many cannot even open their electronic doors. Hospitals operating on generator backup are beginning to calculate how many days of diesel fuel they have and how many critical patients they cannot transfer. The water, this is the one that surprises people who haven't thought it through. The water stops. Not immediately, not in the first day, but the water treatment plants that purify your tap water run on electricity. The pumping stations that maintain the pressure in your water mains run on electricity. As backup generators at water utilities run out of fuel, which in most cases happens within 72 hours, the water pressure in your pipes drops to 0. And then your toilet doesn't flush. Your faucet doesn't flow. And you realize that in an urban apartment building, you don't have any water stored anywhere, and the bottles at the grocery store are already gone, and you are beginning to experience something that Americans alive today have simply never experienced at scale. Genuine, immediate physical desperation. The first week is the hardest to imagine for anyone who has lived their entire life inside the comfortable infrastructure of modernity. It is hard to imagine, but let's try. You live in a city, maybe Chicago, maybe Phoenix, maybe Denver. Your refrigerator stopped working on day 1. Everything in it is now room temperature and beginning to spoil. You have, if you were prepared, perhaps a few days of non-perishable food. If you were not prepared, and statistically most Americans are not, you have perhaps a day or 2 of food that doesn't require cooking. Your stove is electric, so cooking is not happening. Your gas stove, if you have one, still works, but only with a match because the electronic ignition is dead. And your gas supply itself may last only as long as the gas utility can maintain pressure in the distribution system without electricity to run the compressors. In some cities, gas goes within 2 to 3 days. In others, it lasts longer. Your phone is dead. Your laptop is dead. Your car, if it is a modern car with a sophisticated electronics package, may or may not work, depending on whether the geomagnetic storm also produced enough EMP-like effects to damage sensitive automotive electronics. Newer electric vehicles are certainly non-functional. Many modern gasoline and diesel vehicles with complex engine management computers may also be non-functional or intermittently unreliable. Older vehicles, pre-1980s cars with minimal electronics, start and run fine, and suddenly people who own them as hobby vehicles are finding that they own the most valuable transportation asset in their neighborhood. The people who do most poorly in the first week are the ones who stay put and wait. Wait for the power to come back. Wait for the government to organize help. Wait for the cell service to return so they can call someone and figure out what is happening. The waiting is understandable. It is what every previous power outage has taught us to do. But in this scenario, the waiting is lethal, because help is not coming quickly enough, and every day you wait without water, without food, without medicine, is a day closer to a medical emergency. The people who do best in the first week are, perhaps surprisingly, not the hardcore survivalists with underground bunkers and years of freeze-dried food. In an urban environment, bunkers are not particularly useful. The people who do best are the ones who understand their community, who know their neighbors, who know where the nearest source of running water is, who know which local business owners might have generators and supplies, who can organize informal mutual aid quickly and efficiently. They are the ones who start walking to the nearest emergency coordination point, which in most cities will be established at schools, community centers, or churches within the first 48 to 72 hours of a federally declared emergency, and who contribute their skills and knowledge to the group rather than hoarding individually. This is not idealism. This is empirically what happens in disasters. The sociologist Lee Clark spent decades studying how people actually behave in catastrophes, and the data consistently challenges our Hollywood-informed assumptions. The German sociologist Wolf Dombrowski studied disaster behavior across dozens of events and reached the same conclusions. The disaster as chaos narrative, the Hobbesian war of all against all that fiction returns to again and again, is a persistent cultural myth that almost never reflects documented reality. The real pattern is that social cohesion typically increases in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, not decreases. Strangers help strangers. Communities self-organize. Informal leadership emerges rapidly from people who were nobody in particular before the crisis and who turn out to be exactly what the situation demands. The disaster movies show looting, violence, every man for himself chaos. The reality, documented across dozens of major disasters, is overwhelmingly cooperative. People share food. People help strangers. Emergency mutual aid networks form spontaneously. The instances of violence and crime during major disasters are far rarer than the fictional depictions, and they typically occur in the specific conditions of prolonged resource deprivation in areas where the social trust was already severely degraded before the disaster began. What this means, practically, is that the best thing any individual can do to prepare for a grid failure scenario is not to acquire weapons and fortify their position against their neighbors. It is to know their neighbors, to know who on their block has medical training, to know which household has a wood-burning stove, which family has a large vegetable garden, which person has mechanical skills that are going to be in extraordinary demand when nothing electronic works. The mutual knowledge, the social fabric, the pre-existing web of relationship and trust. These are the most valuable resources in a disaster, and they are resources that are free to create, available to everyone, and that improve daily life in ordinary times as well as catastrophic ones. A neighborhood where people know each other is more pleasant to live in when everything is working. It is more survivable when nothing is. But prolonged resource deprivation is the key phrase there, because a one-week grid failure is a manageable catastrophe. A one-month grid failure is a serious crisis. A 6-month grid failure is a civilizational rupture. And if the transformer damage is severe enough, that last scenario is not impossible. Let's talk about food, because food is where the long-term crisis becomes most visible and most visceral. The modern American food system is a just-in-time miracle of logistics that most of us have never had reason to examine closely. Your local grocery store, at any given moment, has approximately 3 days of food on its shelves. That's it. 3 days. The food on those shelves arrived within the past few days on refrigerated trucks, which loaded at regional distribution centers, which were resupplied by long-haul trucking, which transported food from processing facilities, which received it from farms. Every step of this chain runs on fuel, and fuel requires an operational economy to produce, refine, and distribute. Every step also involves refrigeration, which requires electricity. In the first week after a major grid failure, most of the perishable food in the affected area spoils. Meat, dairy, produce gone. What remains in stores is shelf-stable. Canned goods, dried beans, rice, pasta, crackers, peanut butter. In a normal functioning society with an operational government and logistics network, emergency food stocks and distribution systems could manage the situation for weeks or months. FEMA maintains strategic stockpiles. The Department of Defense has logistics capacity. The National Guard can run distribution points. These systems are real and they are functional, but they are designed to handle regional disasters affecting perhaps millions of people for weeks at a time. They are not designed to handle a simultaneous nationwide grid failure affecting tens of millions of people for months or years. The farms are still there. The food growing in American fields and orchards is still there, but harvesting it at scale requires diesel-powered combines and tractors. Transporting it requires diesel trucks. Processing and preserving it requires electricity. And distributing it equitably requires an organizational and logistical infrastructure that cannot simply be improvised overnight when the people running it have no communications, no fuel, and no power themselves. The communities that survive best in historical analogs from major blackouts, natural disasters, and infrastructure failures are the ones with the shortest supply chains. Rural communities with active farming heritage, access to land, access to wood fuel, and social structures that still retain institutional memory of pre-electric living do substantially better than densely urban environments in the long term. This is the great urban paradox of the modern era. The same concentration of people and resources that makes cities extraordinarily efficient in good times makes them extraordinarily vulnerable in catastrophic ones. In Phoenix, Arizona, a city of 5 million people in the middle of a desert, the situation after grid failure becomes acute within 3 days. Without electricity, air conditioning stops. Without air conditioning, summer temperatures inside residential structures quickly approach the outdoor temperature, which in Phoenix in July can exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat mortality, death from hyperthermia in elderly residents, infants, and people with certain medical conditions begins within 48 to 72 hours in those temperatures. Phoenix is, by almost any analysis, the most vulnerable major American city to a prolonged grid failure in summer conditions. The city was built on the premise of infinite cheap electricity. Without it, the city, at least in July, becomes genuinely uninhabitable for a large fraction of its population. Miami faces different but equally severe challenges. The water table in South Florida is so shallow and so close to sea level that without constant electric pumping, the stormwater and sewage systems begin to fail almost immediately. The prospect of raw sewage contamination in the water supply, which in a tropical environment creates ideal conditions for cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases that Americans have not experienced at epidemic scale in a century, is a public health catastrophe that unfolds in slow motion, beginning in the second and third week. Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit, these cities face the specific horror of winter. Without heat, without gas or electricity to run furnaces, the interior of an unheated building in Chicago in January approaches outdoor temperature. Chicago's average January temperature is around 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Without active heating, an uninsulated residential building reaches that temperature within a day or two. Hypothermia becomes a mass casualty event. The most vulnerable, the elderly, the very young, the homeless, die first. But the healthy die too, if the cold is severe enough and the grid does not return. I want to pause here and be clear about something because it is important. What I am describing are the consequences of worst-case scenarios where the grid failure is both severe and prolonged, and where government and emergency response systems are overwhelmed to the point of ineffectiveness. I am not predicting that all of these catastrophes would happen simultaneously in every city in America. I am describing the physics and logistics of what becomes possible when the foundational infrastructure of modern life is removed for an extended period. Most American cities have some combination of backup systems, emergency management capacity, military resources, and social resilience that would blunt these outcomes. But blunting is not preventing. And some cities, in some scenarios, would face exactly the conditions I am describing. Now let's zoom out from the human experience and look at what the recovery actually looks like from an infrastructure standpoint, because this is where the story becomes most sobering of all. You cannot simply restart a large electrical grid the way you restart a computer. A massive interconnected grid that has lost power across a wide area cannot simply be switched back on. It has to be carefully, methodically rebuilt one segment at a time through a process called a black start. In a black start, specially designated power plants, typically hydro facilities or certain gas turbine plants that can start without external electrical power, begin generating power in isolation. Their output is then carefully synchronized with adjacent isolated sections of grid, one connection at a time, gradually expanding the energized zone in a controlled manner that avoids the kind of frequency and voltage instabilities that caused the initial collapse. This process, even under normal circumstances with trained operators and functioning communications and intact equipment, takes days to weeks for a large regional outage. After a Carrington-scale event, where an unknown number of critical transformers have been damaged or destroyed, and where the communications infrastructure that grid operators use to coordinate restoration has also been severely degraded, the process becomes exponentially more complex. You cannot energize a transmission line that connects to a destroyed transformer. Doing so risks further damage to adjacent equipment. You have to know, before you start, which transformers are functional and which are not. Getting that information requires dispatching crews to physically inspect thousands of pieces of equipment across thousands of miles of transmission infrastructure, in conditions where ground transportation is compromised and aviation fuel is being rationed. And then, once you know which transformers survived and which didn't, you have to live with that knowledge. The ones that didn't survive need to be replaced. Each replacement transformer weighs between 400 and 500 tons. Moving a transformer of that weight requires specialized transport equipment. Custom-built multi-axle trailers pulled by multiple heavy trucks, with road surveys conducted in advance to ensure the route can handle the weight, bridges pre-inspected or bypassed, utility lines temporarily de-energized along the entire route. Under normal circumstances, a single transformer relocation takes weeks to plan and execute. In a post-storm environment where the roads are clogged with abandoned vehicles, the bridges may have had their load ratings compromised by deferred maintenance, and the escort vehicles and specialized transport equipment are themselves in short supply. The logistics become a puzzle of extraordinary difficulty. All of this takes place in an environment without electricity, where the command and control systems of government and utility companies are operating on backup power at best, where the population in the affected area is becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly mobile, people leaving cities on foot, by bicycle, in the older cars that still work, and where maintaining public order across a dark continent is consuming a substantial fraction of the available military and law enforcement resources. The federal government in this scenario is not paralyzed. I want to be clear about that. FEMA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, and the National Guard all have pre-planned response procedures for extreme space weather events. After the 2003 Halloween geomagnetic storms caused significant grid disturbances across North America and a complete blackout in Sweden, the awareness of this threat at the policy level has increased substantially. The SHIELD Act, the Secure High Voltage Infrastructure for Electricity from Lethal Damage Act, was introduced multiple times in Congress specifically to address this vulnerability. Executive Order 13744, signed in 2016, directed federal agencies to develop plans for extreme space weather events. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has issued standards requiring grid operators to assess their geomagnetic vulnerability. But awareness is not the same as preparedness. Standards are not the same as implementation. And the fundamental physics of transformer replacement, the weight, the manufacturing lead time, the specialized logistics, cannot be legislated away. You can mandate that grid operators identify their critical transformers. You can encourage the prepositioning of spare transformers. You can develop detailed emergency response protocols. But if the storm is large enough and enough transformers fail, the gap between the infrastructure needed to sustain civilization and the infrastructure that actually exists after the storm will be bridged by nothing but time. And time, in this context, means years. There are people working on solutions to this. The DHS has funded research into temporary power transformers, essentially portable transformer units that can be deployed quickly and can carry a fraction of the normal transmission capacity, enough to restore partial grid function to critical facilities while permanent replacements are manufactured and installed. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has developed the Rapidly Deployable Power Module, a system designed to provide emergency power to critical installations. Some utilities have begun purchasing spare high-voltage transformers and storing them in hardened facilities specifically against this risk. South Korea and Germany, the primary manufacturers of large power transformers, have had conversations at the government level about emergency manufacturing agreements. These are real, meaningful steps, but the scale of the potential problem and the scale of the current preparations are not yet matched. The number of prepositioned spare transformers in the United States is in the dozens. The number of transformers that could be destroyed in a severe Carrington-scale event is in the hundreds. This is not a close call. Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in the public conversation about grid vulnerability to space weather: the hospitals. Because the hospitals are where the human cost of extended grid failure becomes most immediate and most devastating. American hospitals have emergency generator systems. They are required to by law. These generators kick in automatically when grid power fails and keep critical systems, operating rooms, ICUs, ventilators, monitoring equipment, lighting, operational during an outage. This is a well-designed, well-maintained system that works very well for the kinds of power outages hospitals normally face. The standard hospital generator system is designed to run for approximately 72 to 96 hours on its on-site diesel fuel supply, after which it depends on diesel fuel deliveries to continue operating. In a scenario where the grid is down for weeks, every hospital in the affected area is now entirely dependent on a continuous chain of diesel fuel deliveries. Diesel has to be produced in refineries. Refineries run on electricity. The electricity that the refineries use comes from the grid. In some areas, refineries have their own backup power generation capacity and can continue limited operations after grid failure. In others, they cannot. Even where refinery capacity is maintained, transporting diesel from refineries to hospitals across a dark, fuel-starved landscape, where every other institution and individual is competing for the same fuel supply, is an emergency logistics challenge of the highest order. The patients who are most immediately at risk are those dependent on powered medical equipment. Ventilators, dialysis machines, insulin refrigeration. A patient on a ventilator in an ICU has essentially no capacity to survive an extended power failure without a reliable backup power source. There are approximately 960,000 hospital beds in the United States. The number of patients at any given time who are dependent on powered life-sustaining equipment is in the hundreds of thousands. In an extended grid failure, triage decisions of extraordinary moral difficulty, decisions about who receives the available power and who does not, become unavoidable at hospitals across the country. The dialysis situation deserves special attention. Approximately 550,000 Americans are on dialysis for chronic kidney failure. They require dialysis treatment 3 times per week to stay alive. Dialysis machines require electricity. They also require large volumes of purified water. In a prolonged grid failure, the dialysis infrastructure, the clinics, the equipment, the purified water supply will fail. There is no portable, off-grid, scalable alternative for dialysis at the scale of 500,000 patients. This is not a solvable problem in real time. This is a population of 500,000 Americans who face a direct, acute threat to their lives within days to weeks of an extended grid failure. It is one of the most sobering specific statistics in the entire space weather risk literature, and it almost never appears in the public discussion. The same logic applies, to varying degrees, to insulin-dependent diabetics who cannot maintain cold storage for their insulin, to cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy who cannot receive their scheduled treatments, to patients awaiting organ transplants, to premature infants in neonatal ICUs. The grid in modern America is not just a convenience. It is a life support system for millions of people simultaneously. And we have built our civilization with extraordinary success, at extraordinary benefit to human health and longevity, around the assumption that this life support system will always be available. Now let's talk about money. Because even in a catastrophe of this scale, money matters, or rather, the systems that money runs on matter, and the failure of those systems creates a cascade of secondary problems that compounds the physical crisis. Modern American commerce is entirely dependent on electronic payment systems. Cash transactions account for a shrinking fraction of economic activity, something like 19% of consumer transactions in the United States as of the early 2020s, and that fraction has been declining steadily for decades. Your debit card, your credit card, your Venmo, your Apple Pay, all of these depend on electronic networks that depend on electricity. When the grid goes down, electronic payment processing goes with it. ATMs, which run on electricity, stop working. Bank branches, which run on electricity, cannot operate. The ledgers that record who owns what are all in computer systems that depend on electricity to remain accessible. Now, the actual money, the data recording the existence of your bank account balance, doesn't disappear. It's backed up in multiple data centers with redundant power systems, and financial institutions have extraordinarily robust disaster recovery infrastructure. Your money, abstractly, is fine, but you cannot access it, because accessing it requires computers and networks and electricity. And the things you need to survive, food, water, fuel, medicine, are distributed by a commercial system that cannot accept payment from you in any form it can verify. In this environment, barter returns, not as a philosophical choice or an ideological statement, but as a practical necessity. People trade what they have for what they need. Skills become currency, the ability to start a fire, to purify water, to provide medical care, to fix a mechanical problem, to provide security, becomes more valuable than almost any physical commodity. Neighbors who knew each other casually before the crisis find themselves in webs of reciprocal obligation and mutual aid that have not existed in American social life since before the Industrial Revolution. This is not romanticization. Barter is profoundly inefficient compared to money. The transition to informal exchange systems causes enormous economic waste and suffering. But it is also, historically, what happens. And it reveals something interesting about the nature of value. That the things we have been trained to think of as valuable, financial instruments, brand recognition, luxury goods, status symbols, become essentially worthless within days of a true infrastructure collapse, while the things we have been trained to think of as ordinary, the ability to cook, to preserve food, to navigate by landmarks, to work with your hands, to know your neighbors, become the foundations of survival. Let me tell you about a near miss. Not 1859, more recent than that. July 23, 2012. A massive solar eruption, one of the largest in recorded modern history, blasted off the surface of the sun and raced through space at approximately 3,000 kilometers per second. Scientists who later analyzed the data estimated that this coronal mass ejection, if it had been aimed at Earth, would have produced a geomagnetic storm comparable in magnitude to the Carrington Event. The peak magnetic field in the ejected plasma was stronger than any previously recorded. The speed of the event exceeded that of anything in the modern observation record. It missed Earth by 9 days. Earth's orbit carries our planet at roughly 30 kilometers per second around the Sun. 9 days of orbital travel at that speed equals approximately 23 million kilometers of displacement along our orbital path. The CME that would have potentially ended modern civilization as we know it missed us by 23 million kilometers. In the scale of the solar system, that is essentially nothing. It is a cosmic near-miss by the thinnest of margins. The physicist Daniel Baker, who was part of the team that analyzed the 2012 event, said afterward that if the eruption had occurred just 1 week earlier, Earth would have been in the path of the plasma cloud. He said, and I want to get this right because it is one of the most important things a space physicist has said publicly in the last decade, that had the 2012 event hit Earth, we would likely still be recovering from it today. We would still be recovering from it today. That was said in 2014. In 2014, Baker said we would still be recovering from a 2012 event that hit Earth. We are now more than a decade past 2012. We would still be recovering. The 2012 near miss received almost no public attention. It was covered briefly in science press. A few news organizations ran brief items. It did not penetrate public consciousness in any meaningful way. The asteroid that narrowly missed Earth makes headlines. The coronal mass ejection that would have destroyed the electrical grid of the industrialized world and killed, according to various estimates, somewhere between tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people through secondary effects, over months and years of infrastructure collapse, that doesn't make headlines in the way it should. Because it is difficult to visualize, difficult to feel urgency about something that almost happened but didn't, difficult to construct the kind of dramatic narrative around a near miss that drives sustained public attention and political action. But the sun doesn't care about our attention spans. The sun doesn't care whether we've thought about this problem or not. The sun is going to keep doing what it has been doing for 4.5 billion years. Converting matter to energy in a nuclear furnace, building up and releasing magnetic stresses in ways that periodically blast enormous quantities of magnetized plasma into the inner solar system. This will happen again. The physics guarantee it. The only variables are the size of the event, the direction of the ejected plasma, the orientation of the embedded magnetic field when it hits Earth's magnetosphere, and here is the only variable that human action can influence, the resilience of our infrastructure when it does. So what can be done? Let's talk about solutions because there are real ones, and some of them are surprisingly tractable given the scale of the threat. The first and most important solution is one that has been studied exhaustively. Installing blocking devices. sometimes called GIC blockers or neutral ground resistors, on the high-voltage transformers that form the backbone of the grid. The physics are well understood. A geomagnetically induced current is a direct current trying to flow through a system designed for alternating current. If you can prevent the DC current from entering the transformer by inserting a resistor or capacitor in the path of the induced current, you can protect the transformer from the saturation that leads to overheating and failure. Various implementations of this idea have been tested and in some cases deployed. The cost of retrofitting the entire North American grid with GIC protection devices has been estimated at somewhere between $1 and $2 billion. $1 to $2 billion to protect infrastructure that costs in the hundreds of billions and supports an economy worth tens of trillions. By any cost-benefit analysis ever applied to infrastructure investment, this is one of the most obvious investments in the history of American public policy. It has not happened at scale, partly due to regulatory fragmentation. The grid is managed by dozens of independent utilities with different regulatory frameworks, and partly due to the timeless human difficulty of acting urgently on threats that have not yet materialized. The second solution is the strategic stockpiling of spare transformers. Several utilities have participated in a program called EHV Spares, a cooperative arrangement where participating utilities maintain spare extra high-voltage transformers in hardened storage facilities, available for emergency deployment across the network. The program is real and growing, but the inventory of available spares is still far below what a severe storm would require. Expanding this program, and crucially, building transformer storage facilities that are themselves designed to survive extreme geomagnetic conditions, is achievable with existing technology and known costs. It requires sustained political will and regulatory commitment. The third solution is the development and deployment of temporary transformer technology. I mentioned the DHS research into rapidly deployable power modules. These are not a perfect substitute for large permanent transformers. They are smaller, carry less capacity, and require substantial installation effort. But they can restore partial power to critical facilities, hospitals, water treatment plants, emergency communication centers, government operations, in a time frame of days rather than months, bridging the most critical gap in a recovery scenario. Continued investment in this technology and prepositioning of these systems in strategic locations would substantially improve resilience. The fourth solution is at the level of individual and community preparation. In the immediate aftermath of a grid failure, the difference between a community that survives the first month in reasonable condition and one that experiences mass casualties is largely determined by how much resilience was built in before the event. This is a lesson we keep learning from natural disasters and keep forgetting between them. Water storage, the recommendation of 1 gallon per person per day for 2 weeks is a minimum, not an optimal, is achievable for most households. Non-perishable food stockpiles, alternative heating sources in cold climates, solar charging panels for communications equipment, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio for receiving emergency broadcasts, knowledge of where the nearest emergency water source is located, knowing your neighbors. These are not exotic preparations. They are the basics that every emergency management professional recommends and that most Americans have never implemented. There is something worth understanding about the psychology of disaster preparation, because it explains why the gap between what we know and what we do is so consistently large. Human beings are remarkably good at evaluating near-term, concrete, visible threats. We are remarkably poor at evaluating distant, abstract, low-probability but high-consequence threats. This is not stupidity. It is a specific, documented cognitive pattern that appears to be deeply wired into how human brains assess and prioritize risk. The behavioral economists call it probability neglect or scope insensitivity. When the probability of a bad outcome is very low, we tend to treat it as zero, regardless of how catastrophic the outcome would be. When the outcome is distributed across millions of people we don't know, we discount it relative to outcomes affecting people we can visualize. When the threat is caused by the natural behavior of a star 93 million miles away rather than by a human adversary we can identify and focus our anxiety on, it feels somehow less urgent. All of this is completely understandable, and all of it has consequences. The consequences are visible in the legislative history of the SHIELD Act, which has been introduced and failed to pass multiple times. The consequences are visible in the gap between FERC's assessment of grid vulnerability and the actual implementation of protective measures. The consequences are visible in the polling data, which consistently shows that while most Americans have heard of electromagnetic pulse as a threat, almost none of them have taken meaningful preparation steps in response. But here is what I find genuinely hopeful, and I want to end the technical portion of this discussion on a note that is honest about both the severity of the threat and the genuine human capacity to respond to it. The space weather forecasting systems we have today are dramatically better than they were even 20 years ago. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center monitors the sun continuously with a network of ground-based and space-based instruments. The Discover satellite, the Deep Space Climate Observatory, sits at the L1 Lagrange point, a gravitational balance point between Earth and the Sun approximately 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, and monitors the solar wind in real time. When a coronal mass ejection passes Discover, it gives us between 15 and 60 minutes of warning before the storm hits Earth's magnetosphere. This is not a lot of time, but it is enough time, if the warning is acted on immediately and aggressively, to take emergency protective actions that can substantially reduce grid damage. The most important protective action is grid de-energization, deliberately taking the most vulnerable portions of the high-voltage transmission network offline before the storm hits. A transformer that is not carrying current when the geomagnetically induced current arrives is much less likely to be damaged. This is controversial. Deliberately shutting down parts of the grid means deliberately cutting power to homes and businesses and hospitals and traffic systems in the middle of whatever weather conditions and daily activity are ongoing. It is the kind of action that requires clear regulatory authority, clear operational protocols, and the political will to act on a warning rather than waiting for proof of damage. All of these things are improving. The NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center has worked extensively with grid operators to develop warning protocols. FERC has issued guidance on emergency operations during severe geomagnetic storms. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has integrated extreme space weather scenarios into its national planning frameworks. The other hopeful development is the advance of renewable energy and distributed power generation. A solar superstorm's effects on the grid are most devastating precisely because the grid is centralized. A relatively small number of critical high-voltage transformers carrying enormous amounts of power over enormous distances, with the failure of any one of them capable of triggering cascading failures across thousands of miles. A more distributed generation system, one where neighborhoods or communities or individual buildings generate and store a substantial fraction of their own electricity, is inherently more resilient to this kind of attack. The home solar panel system that charges a battery pack reduces your dependence on the large grid during normal times and keeps your lights on when the grid fails. At the community level, microgrids, local generation and distribution systems that can operate independently of the main grid represent exactly the kind of resilience architecture that reduces the catastrophic potential of a space weather event. This is not just a silver lining. It is a genuine case where addressing one problem, climate change, through the transition to renewable energy and distributed generation, simultaneously addresses another problem, grid resilience in the face of extreme space weather. The policy goals align. The technology improvements compound. Solar panels are cheaper than they have ever been. Battery storage is improving rapidly. The economic and environmental case for distributed energy is powerful. The resilience case is equally powerful. And yet, the transition is happening more slowly than the physics of both climate change and space weather would ideally demand. I want to tell you about the people who have been thinking about this the longest and hardest, because they are not the people you might expect. They are not, primarily, the conspiracy theorists and prepper communities, though those communities have developed genuine practical knowledge that the mainstream tends to dismiss too quickly. The people who think most rigorously about solar storm risk are astronomers, physicists, electrical engineers, insurance actuaries, military planners, and the national security professionals at agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. These are the people who have read the technical assessments, who have run the models, who have done the math on transformer replacement timelines and dialysis patient populations and hospital generator fuel capacity. And what is striking when you talk to these people, when you read their papers and their policy recommendations and their public statements, is how uniform the message is. They don't disagree about the severity of the threat. They don't disagree about the technical vulnerabilities. They don't disagree that existing protective measures are insufficient relative to the scale of the risk. What they disagree about, what they despair about, is how to translate technical certainty into political action in a democratic system that is designed to respond to immediate visible problems and that does so poorly with long-duration statistical risks. This is, I think, one of the defining governance challenges of the 21st century. We have built technologies of extraordinary power and complexity. We understand, in extraordinary detail, the ways in which those technologies can be disrupted by natural events. We have the engineering knowledge and the financial resources to substantially reduce those vulnerabilities. And yet the gap between knowing and doing yawns as wide as it has ever been, because the political systems through which collective action must be organized are not well designed for this kind of challenge. This is not a problem unique to space weather. It is the same problem that applies to pandemic preparedness, to seismic risk in earthquake zones, to the long-term management of nuclear waste, to the funding of infrastructure maintenance across decades and political cycles. The Carrington Event of 1859 was, in its time, an extraordinary natural spectacle that caused remarkable disruptions to a remarkably primitive technology. Telegraphs sparked. Operators received shocks. Some offices burned. The world noted the event, marveled at it, and moved on. It did not shake the foundations of civilization because civilization's foundations in 1859 did not rest on electricity. Our civilization's foundations do. Every system of modern life that we depend on, the distribution of food and water, the delivery of medical care, the functioning of economic exchange, the operation of communications and transportation, the management of the tens of thousands of complex interdependent systems that sustain 7 billion human lives, all of it rests, ultimately, on the continuous availability of electrical power. We built this extraordinary structure on that foundation, and it has served us magnificently. The life expectancy gains, the reduction in poverty, the explosion of human knowledge and capability and communication that electricity made possible. These are among the greatest achievements in the history of our species. But the foundation has a vulnerability that the builders did not fully understand when they began building. The sun has always had the power to disrupt it. And the more we have built upon that foundation, the higher the structure rises, and the more catastrophic the consequences if the foundation shifts. Let's talk about nuclear power plants because they deserve their own moment in this conversation, and because the story they tell is simultaneously more reassuring and more unsettling than most people expect. The United States has 93 operating nuclear reactors at 54 power plant sites, generating roughly 20% of the nation's electricity. Nuclear power plants are, by design, among the most hardened pieces of infrastructure in the country. They have multiple redundant safety systems, extensive backup power supplies, and rigorously trained operators who run emergency drills constantly. So when the grid goes down, nuclear plants do something that sounds counterintuitive. They shut down. Automatically. It is called a scram, a term from the early days of nuclear technology referring to the emergency shutdown procedure. When the external grid fails, nuclear reactors detect the loss of external electrical load and initiate an automatic shutdown sequence that inserts the control rods and stops the fission reaction within seconds. This is the right response, and the nuclear power system is well designed to handle it. But here is the thing about nuclear reactors that most people don't know, and that matters enormously in the context of a prolonged grid failure. Even after a reactor shuts down and the fission stops, the nuclear fuel inside the reactor core continues to generate enormous amounts of heat. This is called decay heat, and it comes from the radioactive decay of the fission products, the byproducts of the nuclear reaction, inside the fuel. In the first hour after shutdown, decay heat can be as much as 7% of the reactor's full operating power. It drops rapidly after that, but it continues for days, weeks, and in diminishing amounts for months. To manage decay heat, nuclear plants need to continuously circulate cooling water through the reactor core. This cooling requires electricity. Under normal circumstances, the plant generates its own electricity and has no problem cooling itself. But in a complete grid failure, with the reactor shut down and not generating power, the plant has to rely on its own emergency diesel generators to power the cooling systems. These diesel generators are designed to run for days, typically 72 hours at full operation before refueling is required. They are robust, well-maintained, and regularly tested. Most people alive today remember what happened in Fukushima, Japan in March 2011. A massive earthquake triggered a tsunami that disabled the emergency diesel generators at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Without power to run the cooling systems, 3 reactor cores overheated. 3 reactors experienced full or partial meltdowns. Radioactive material was released into the environment. The cleanup and containment effort continues to this day, more than a decade later, and will likely continue for decades more. The total area affected by mandatory evacuation orders encompassed hundreds of square kilometers. Roughly 150,000 people were displaced from their homes. In a Carrington-scale grid failure, nuclear plants across the country are not facing a tsunami. Their generators are intact, but they are facing the same fundamental question that Fukushima faced. How long can we keep cooling this reactor core? And what happens when we run out of the fuel to do it? In a prolonged grid failure where diesel fuel resupply chains have been disrupted, where every hospital and data center and water treatment plant in the country is also competing for the same diesel supply, and where the grid restoration timeline is measured in months rather than days, the nuclear cooling question becomes increasingly acute. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is aware of this. After Fukushima, the NRC implemented a series of post-Fukushima modifications at American nuclear plants specifically designed to improve their resilience to prolonged station blackouts, a condition where a plant loses all external grid power and must rely entirely on backup power. These modifications include additional portable emergency equipment, additional diesel fuel storage, and procedures for extended station blackout operation. The nuclear industry has taken the lessons of Fukushima seriously, and American nuclear plants are substantially more resilient to prolonged grid failure than they were before 2011. But resilience is not invulnerability. And in the tail of the worst-case scenarios, where the grid is down for months in regions that include nuclear power plant sites, and where diesel resupply becomes genuinely difficult to sustain, the nuclear cooling question remains one that demands continuous attention and does not have a comfortable answer. Now let's talk about communications. Because in the immediate aftermath of a grid failure, the thing that people most desperately need and most consistently lack is accurate information about what is happening and what to do. And the communications infrastructure of the modern United States is, it turns out, far more fragile than most people assume. The internet has become so fundamental to how information moves in America that it is easy to forget that it depends at every level on physical infrastructure that requires electricity to operate. The servers that host websites and databases run on electricity. The routers that direct traffic run on electricity. The fiber optic network that carries data across the country has amplifiers and repeaters every few dozen miles that run on electricity. The cellular towers that connect your phone to the network run on electricity, with 4 to 8 hours of battery backup, after which they go dark. The undersea cables that connect North America to Europe and Asia have repeaters on the seafloor that run on electricity supplied from shore stations. The backbone of the internet, the major routing infrastructure in large data centers, is among the best protected equipment in the country in terms of backup power. Major internet exchange points and Tier 1 network operators have generator backup systems designed to run for days or weeks. So in a partial grid failure, much of the core internet infrastructure might remain functional, but the edge of the network, where individual users connect, is dependent on cellular towers and cable modems and DSL equipment that has hours, not days, of battery backup. What this means in practice is that in the first 4 to 8 hours of a major grid failure, most people still have cell service and can get information from the internet. In the 8 to 24-hour window, cell service begins dropping off as individual towers exhaust their batteries, unless refueling of tower generators is organized quickly. After 24 hours, in areas without active generator fueling programs, large portions of the cellular network are dark. And at that point, the primary information medium for the vast majority of Americans, the smartphone connected to the internet, becomes a dead rectangle of glass and metal. What remains? Battery-powered AM, FM radios. This is, I realize, the most profoundly retro sentence I am going to say in this entire script, but it is also among the most important practical facts in the entire discussion. The emergency broadcast system, the system that interrupts regular radio programming to deliver emergency information, runs on AM and FM radio towers that are, at most major stations, equipped with substantial generator backup. They are the emergency communication systems specifically because they can operate independently of the cellular and internet networks. And a battery-powered AM radio, available at any hardware store for $15, can receive that emergency broadcast information for weeks on a set of batteries. This is not a secret. FEMA has been recommending battery-powered radios as emergency kit essentials for decades. NOAA has a network of dedicated weather radio stations that broadcast continuously on specific frequencies. But in a world where everyone carries a supercomputer in their pocket that gives them access to essentially all human information on demand, the idea of owning a separate radio specifically for emergencies has come to feel quaint, the kind of thing your grandparents did before technology got good. And so most people don't have one. And in a real grid failure, they find themselves in a communications blackout that is, psychologically, one of the most disorienting aspects of the entire experience. Not knowing what is happening, not knowing whether this is a regional event or a national one, not knowing whether help is coming, not knowing whether it is safe to stay or necessary to leave, that informational vacuum is where fear and rumor and bad decisions fill the space that facts should occupy. The amateur radio community, ham radio operators, are, in this context, a genuinely important emergency communications resource that gets almost no attention in mainstream disaster preparedness discussion. There are approximately 750,000 licensed amateur radio operators in the United States. Many of them have equipment capable of communicating across hundreds or thousands of miles without any infrastructure other than their own radio sets and antennas. In major disasters, including Hurricane Katrina, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and numerous other events, amateur radio operators have provided critical communications links when all professional infrastructure failed. In a grid failure scenario, the amateur radio community would represent one of the few remaining long-range communication capabilities available to civilian emergency coordinators. The lesson from the communications vulnerability is the same lesson as the lesson from the water vulnerability and the food vulnerability. The more distributed your system, the more resilient it is. A communications infrastructure where every household has at least a basic receiver capable of accessing emergency broadcasts, and where the amateur radio community provides the long-range backbone for coordinating emergency response, is fundamentally more resilient than one where everyone depends entirely on centralized cellular and internet infrastructure. This is not a particularly expensive or technically sophisticated vision. It requires only the recognition that these older technologies, which we have been replacing with newer ones, provided capabilities that the newer ones cannot replicate when the power goes out. The international dimension of a major space weather event is also underappreciated in most public discussions, which tend to focus on the American experience. A Carrington-scale event does not respect national borders. The geomagnetic storm affects the entire Earth simultaneously. The geographic variation in impact depends on proximity to the magnetic poles, local geology affecting ground conductivity, and the specifics of local grid design, but every country with a high-voltage transmission grid faces similar risks. Europe is, in some ways, more vulnerable than North America because the European grid operates at higher latitudes on average, and because the highly conductive geology of Scandinavia and parts of Central Europe creates conditions for intense geomagnetically induced currents. The 1989 geomagnetic storm, which caused the Quebec blackout, also caused transformer damage in several European countries. During the same storm, Swedish railways experienced signal system failures, and UK power systems required emergency protective action to avoid outages. China, which has been building its electrical grid at extraordinary scale and speed over the past 3 decades, has become increasingly concerned about geomagnetic vulnerability. The Chinese grid includes some of the world's longest high-voltage direct current transmission lines, which have different vulnerability profiles than the alternating current lines that are most susceptible to GIC effects. But the transformer infrastructure that connects these lines to the alternating current network creates specific vulnerability points. Chinese researchers have published extensively on the geomagnetic vulnerability of the Chinese grid, and the Chinese government has in recent years begun implementing protective measures. The interconnection of the global economy means that even countries whose grids are less severely affected by a solar superstorm would experience catastrophic economic consequences from the disruption of their trading partners. If North America and Europe simultaneously experience major grid failures, which is exactly what a large Earth-facing coronal mass ejection would produce, the disruption to global trade, manufacturing, and financial systems would be total. There is no scenario in which Asia continues functioning normally while North America and Europe are in the dark for months. The supply chains are too intertwined, the financial flows too integrated, the communications infrastructure too dependent on undersea cables that terminate in affected countries. This is the full scope of what a Carrington-scale event means for the modern world. It is not a regional disaster. It is not even a national disaster. It is a civilizational stress test of a kind that human societies have not faced in the modern era. A simultaneous, synchronized disruption of the foundational infrastructure of industrial civilization across multiple continents, triggered not by human action but by the physics of a star that has been doing this in various magnitudes since before our species existed. The historical analogs we have for societal response to large-scale infrastructure disruption are not exactly parallel, but they are instructive. The Great Blackout of the northeastern United States and Canada in August 2003, which left 55 million people without power for up to 2 days, revealed both the impressive speed with which large urban populations can adapt to short-term disruption and the fragility of many systems that people had assumed were more robust. Hospitals switched to generators. Water utilities enacted conservation protocols. Gasoline stations with backup generators saw enormous queues. People walked across bridges and found strangers to share what they had. The crisis lasted 2 days, and the social order held remarkably well. The Puerto Rico experience after Hurricane Maria in 2017 offers a much grimmer and more relevant data point for longer-duration grid failure. The hurricane destroyed the island's electrical grid so thoroughly that restoration took 11 months to reach near-complete coverage, and some rural areas went without power for well over a year. During that period, Puerto Rico experienced excess mortality estimated at thousands to tens of thousands of deaths above the historical baseline. Deaths caused primarily not by the storm itself, but by the collapse of the medical infrastructure that depended on electricity. Dialysis patients, oxygen-dependent patients, people whose medications required refrigeration, people whose medical conditions were manageable under normal conditions and lethal without electricity. The death toll from the Puerto Rico experience is a preview, at much smaller scale, in a much warmer climate, of what a prolonged grid failure would mean for a continental population. The response to Puerto Rico was also instructive in a different way. It revealed the extraordinary difficulty of coordinating recovery logistics in an environment where the infrastructure needed to enable recovery has itself been destroyed. FEMA trucks full of relief supplies sat on docks in San Juan for weeks, unable to be distributed to the interior of the island because the roads were damaged and the local logistics network had collapsed. Water was available in the form of federal supplies, but the distribution system to get it to people who needed it was not functioning. This mismatch between available resources and the capacity to distribute them is precisely the failure mode that would characterize a continental grid failure scenario at vastly larger scale. There is one more dimension of the solar superstorm scenario that I want to address directly, because it comes up consistently in the technical literature and almost never appears in the public discussion. The satellites. Modern civilization depends on a vast constellation of satellites orbiting Earth for communications, navigation, weather forecasting, financial transaction timing, military reconnaissance, and a dozen other functions. These satellites are extraordinarily vulnerable to the radiation environment created by a major solar storm. During the intense X-ray and particle radiation that accompanies a large coronal mass ejection, satellite electronics can be damaged by single-event upsets, individual high-energy particles passing through transistors and causing logic errors or permanent damage. Solar cells, which power satellites, can be degraded by prolonged exposure to energetic particles. Satellite orbits can be affected because the enhanced solar radiation causes the upper atmosphere to expand, increasing drag on low Earth orbit satellites and causing them to spiral downward faster than expected. The most vulnerable and most critical satellite system in the context of a geomagnetic storm is GPS. The global positioning system operates on signals that are significantly weakened and distorted by the ionospheric disturbances that accompany major geomagnetic storms. During severe storms, GPS accuracy degrades significantly, and in some cases GPS receivers fail to lock on signals at all. This matters enormously for the modern economy, and not just because you can't get directions on your phone. GPS timing signals are used to synchronize financial transactions, to coordinate cellular network handoffs, to manage air traffic control, to navigate ships, and to time the switching operations of the electrical grid itself. A prolonged GPS outage, which a major space weather event could produce for hours to days, would cascade through these systems in ways that compound the damage caused by the direct geomagnetic effects on the grid. The constellation of communication satellites in low Earth orbit, the Starlink constellation, the OneWeb satellites, and others would face significant radiation environment challenges during a major storm. Some satellites would likely be damaged or destroyed. The operators of these constellations are aware of the risk and design their satellites accordingly. But no satellite design is immune to radiation damage during the most extreme events. A major reduction in the available satellite communication capacity at exactly the moment when ground-based communications have been disrupted by the grid failure would make the already severe communications challenge substantially worse. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from looking at a risk like this directly, without flinching, without either dismissing it or catastrophizing it beyond what the evidence supports. The evidence supports taking it seriously, very seriously. The evidence does not support panic. Panic is never the right response to any threat, because panic degrades exactly the kind of clear-headed planning and community organization that reduces the impact of disasters. But the evidence does support informed action. Learning the basics of water storage and food security, knowing where emergency services in your community are located, understanding the local geography of your water supply and medical resources, and supporting, through your vote and your voice, the policy changes that would make the grid more resilient against the threat that the sun has been posing since the first wire was strung across a continent. We went to the moon because we decided to. We sequenced the human genome because we decided to. We built the International Space Station because we decided to. We eradicated smallpox because we decided to. There is no technical barrier to protecting the electrical grid from extreme space weather. The engineering is understood. The costs are known. The policy frameworks are being developed. What remains is the collective decision to act, the same kind of species-level decision that has historically been made under conditions of urgency, when the consequences of an action become vivid enough to overcome the cognitive inertia of the status quo. The question is whether we make that decision before the next Carrington event or after it. History suggests we will make it after. Everything we know about human psychology and political systems suggests we will make it after. But history also contains exceptions, moments when foresight, rather than hindsight, drove collective action on a scale sufficient to matter. Moments when human beings looked at what the physics actually said was going to happen, rather than waiting for it to happen and chose to act. This could be one of those moments. It doesn't have to be a crisis that teaches us this lesson. The lesson is available right now, from the mathematics of solar cycles and transformer vulnerability and population dependence on electrical infrastructure. The classroom is open. The curriculum has been written. The only thing left is the decision to pay attention. The sun is not our enemy. It is the source of all energy that has ever sustained life on this planet. Every calorie you have ever eaten was solar energy, captured by photosynthesis and passed up a food chain to your table. Every fossil fuel ever burned was ancient sunlight stored in organic matter over hundreds of millions of years. The light streaming through your window right now is the same light that drove the evolution of your visual system over hundreds of millions of generations. We are, in a very literal and not at all metaphorical sense, children of the sun. It made us, and it will go on making life possible on this planet for another 5 billion years. But it is not tame. It is not predictable in detail. It is a nuclear furnace 433,000 times the volume of Earth, with a magnetic field of incomprehensible complexity, generating energy releases that make the most powerful weapons ever built by human beings look like toys. And every once in a while, in its perfectly natural, perfectly indifferent course of magnetic activity, it sends something our way that reminds us what we are. A thin layer of life on the surface of a small rock, orbiting at a comfortable distance from a very large star, protected by a magnetic field generated by our planet's churning iron core, having built in the past 200 years a civilization that depends on the continuous orderly operation of electrical systems in ways that civilization has not yet fully confronted. The grid will fail one day. That is not pessimism. That is physics. The only honest questions are, how severe will the failure be? How long will it last, and how many people will die because we did not prepare, or how few will die because we did? And I want to sit with that word, prepare, for a moment longer, because it is doing a lot of work in this conversation, and it means different things at different scales. At the scale of an individual household, preparation means water. It means food. It means a battery radio and a paper map of your neighborhood and a first aid kit and some cash, actual physical paper cash, because cash works when the grid doesn't, and a conversation with your immediate neighbors about what each of you has and what each of you might need in an emergency. None of this is difficult. None of this is expensive relative to the cost of a single week's worth of takeout food for a family. The preparation that would give your household a meaningful buffer of time and capacity in the first weeks of a grid failure is achievable by the vast majority of Americans who are reading or hearing this, and it is achievable this week if the will is there. At the scale of a community, preparation means knowing where the emergency coordination points are, the schools, the fire stations, the community centers that will become the nerve centers of informal mutual aid when the formal systems are overwhelmed. It means communities having conversations in advance about what their local resources are, which buildings have solar panels and batteries, which residents have medical training, which local businesses have generator capacity, and what inventory they might contribute to the common good in an emergency. These conversations don't require government programs or official initiatives. They require only the recognition that the people most likely to help you in an emergency are the people who are physically close to you, and that knowing them before the emergency makes the emergency less terrible. At the scale of a nation, preparation means the policy changes that I described. The GIC blockers on the high-voltage transformers, the strategic stockpiling of spare transformers, the continued investment in space weather forecasting, the regulatory frameworks that allow grid operators to take preemptive protective action on storm warning. These things require sustained political will and significant public investment. They are not happening fast enough, and they will not happen faster until the public understands the threat well enough to demand them, which is exactly why conversations like this one matter, and why the scientists and engineers who have been trying to communicate this risk for decades deserve to be heard more widely than they have been. At the scale of human civilization, preparation means rethinking the design of the foundational infrastructure of modern life with resilience as an explicit design criterion rather than an afterthought. The grid was built for efficiency, not resilience. The supply chains were built for efficiency. The communication systems were built for efficiency. And efficiency is a magnificent thing. It has made us extraordinarily prosperous and has raised billions of people out of poverty. But efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. An efficient system is optimized for normal operating conditions. A resilient system is designed to degrade gracefully under abnormal conditions rather than failing catastrophically. We need both. We have prioritized efficiency for a century. It is time to invest more seriously in resilience. There is a version of this story that ends badly. That version is the one in which we continue to understand this risk intellectually and fail to act on it practically, right up until the moment when the sun makes the decision for us. That version exists. It is not inevitable, but it is possible, and the probability of it rises with each year of insufficient action. But there is another version of this story, and that version begins with the recognition, spreading slowly but genuinely, through the scientific community and the engineering community and the policy community, and now, perhaps, through conversations like this one reaching wider audiences, that this is a solvable problem. Not perfectly solvable. Not eliminably solvable. The sun will keep doing what the sun does, and a large enough event will always cause some damage. But the difference between a Carrington-scale event that knocks out power for weeks and causes serious but manageable disruption, and a Carrington-scale event that knocks out power for years and causes the deaths of tens of millions of people, that difference is almost entirely a function of choices that human beings are making right now, today, in the design of power systems and the allocation of government budgets and the priorities of regulatory agencies and the individual decisions of households about whether to store water and know their neighbors. That is a remarkably hopeful fact when you really think about it. The most terrifying natural disaster that could befall modern civilization is substantially within our control. Not completely, we cannot stop the sun from doing what it does. But the consequences of what it does are deeply shaped by what we do beforehand. I choose to believe that the answer, in the end, is going to be closer to the second of those options. I choose to believe that because the evidence for human adaptability and ingenuity under pressure is overwhelming, and because the evidence that we are, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to take this threat seriously is real. The satellites monitoring the sun are better than they have ever been. The research into grid protection is ongoing and improving. The regulatory frameworks are slowly tightening. The spare transformer programs are slowly expanding. The awareness among engineers and planners and policymakers is genuinely higher than it was a decade ago, and higher than it was a decade before that. But I also choose to believe it because of something that no policy paper or risk assessment captures well: the sheer improbability of what we already are. We are a species that climbed down from the trees and figured out fire, and from fire we figured out metallurgy, and from metallurgy we figured out machines, and from machines we figured out electricity, and from electricity we built this extraordinary civilization of 8 billion interconnected lives that would have been incomprehensible to our great-grandparents. We did all of that in the blink of a cosmic eye, in 100,000 years, which is nothing to a 4 billion-year-old planet and less than nothing to a 13.8 billion-year-old universe. We are spectacular problem solvers when we choose to be. When we can see the problem clearly enough and feel its urgency strongly enough and organize ourselves effectively enough, there is almost nothing we cannot do. The solar superstorm problem is solvable. It is less technically difficult than going to the moon was in 1961. It is less organizationally complex than the Manhattan Project. It is less expensive than the interstate highway system. The engineering is understood. The interventions are known. The costs are calculable. What it requires is the translation of scientific understanding into public awareness, and public awareness into political will, and political will into action. That translation has happened before on problems of comparable scale in the lifetime of people alive today. It is not enough yet, but it is more than it was. And the direction, which is the thing that matters most when you are racing against a deadline set by solar physics, the direction is the right one. The question is whether we can close the gap between where we are and where we need to be before the sun decides to answer it for us. The last thing I want to leave you with is this: the sky that you are looking at right now, if it is night where you are, contains the sun on the other side of the planet. That star, your star, is at this moment producing magnetic activity that no instrument currently in existence can fully predict. Solar Cycle 25, which began in December 2019, reached its solar maximum in 2024 and 2025. The sun is active. The instruments are watching. And somewhere, out on the surface of that churning plasma ball 93 million miles away, magnetic field lines are twisting and straining against each other in ways that have been building for days or weeks, waiting for the moment when the tension becomes too great and the field snaps into realignment with a flash of light visible across the entire solar system, and billions of tons of plasma begin their journey toward somewhere. Toward Mars, perhaps. Toward Venus. Into the void between the stars. Or toward a small blue planet with a thin magnetic shield and a civilization built on invisible rivers of electrons and a population of 8 billion people who have, for the most part, not thought about this even once today. Watch the sky. Learn your neighborhood. Know your neighbors. Store some water. And the next time you flip a light switch and the lights come on, pause for just a moment and recognize that for what it is. One of the most extraordinary achievements in human history, operating flawlessly as it does billions of times every day, on the assumption that the sun will behave itself a little while longer. Probably will. But it is not a certainty. And certainties in science are rare and precious things. The sun's indifference to our schedules is not a certainty. But it is pretty close to one. The grid hums on. The star burns. And in the gap between those two facts lives everything that matters.